March 14, 1942. 0627 hours. MacDill Field, Tampa, Florida. A coffee cup rattles against its saucer as another B-26 Marauder screams down the runway. Engines howling like tortured machinery. Wings so short they seem like afterthoughts bolted onto a cigar tube with propellers. The sound is wrong, not the steady roar of a B-17 or the confident thunder of a B-24, but something higher-pitched, angrier. As if the aircraft is perpetually on the edge of losing its temper and the battle with gravity simultaneously. Lieutenant Colonel James Maitland watches from the operations shack window, his reflection ghosted against the glass, and counts the seconds until the wheels lift 1001, 1002, 1003. 1004, the Marauder claws into the air with barely 50 feet of runway remaining. Banking hard, left over the palmettos with a wing loading that makes every experienced pilot in the Army Air Forces shake their heads and reach for something stronger than coffee. They are calling it the Widowmaker. They're calling it the Flying Prostitute. No visible means of support. They are calling it, most damningly of all, the Flying Coffin. In 3 months, the B-26 Marauder will achieve the lowest combat loss rate of any American bomber in the Second World War, a statistical impossibility that will be documented in 129,943 combat sorties, recorded in the mission logs of 8 bombardment groups across 3 theaters, verified by German fighter pilots who learned to give the formations wide berths, and captured in the single most improbable number in the history of American military aviation, 0.5% losses per sortie during the final 2 years of European operations. A rate so extraordinarily low that it represents not merely survival, but something approaching invulnerability in a war where flying fortresses are falling from the sky at 7 times that rate, and liberators at nearly 5 times. But on this morning in March 1942, with the wreckage of 4 training aircraft scattered across Florida airfields in the past 6 weeks alone, that future seems as distant and fantastical as victory itself. It's an aircraft designed by sadists for masochists. Captain Eugene Pittman mutters, turning away from the window as the Marauder disappears into low clouds that promise afternoon thunderstorms. He is 26 years old and has already written 2 letters home that he instructed his wife not to open unless he fails to return from what should be, theoretically, a routine training flight. 185 miles per hour minimum approach speed. Wing loading 48 pounds per square foot, and a power-off glide ratio that makes a brick look aerodynamic. The Germans won't need to shoot us down. We'll do their job for them every time we attempt a landing with an engine out. The mathematics seem irrefutable. The B-26's wingspan of 65 feet supporting a fully loaded weight of 37,000 pounds creates an aircraft that must fly fast or not fly at all, that must maintain precise airspeeds during approach or drop like a stone, that offers almost no margin for error, no forgiveness for the momentary inattention or the mechanical failure that are inevitable facts of combat aviation. Compare those numbers against the B-17's wing loading of 37 pounds per square foot, its comfortable approach speed of 90 miles per hour, its reputation for bringing crews home with catastrophic battle damage. And the B-26 appears to be not merely dangerous, but suicidal, a technical marvel of speed and firepower married to handling characteristics that turn every mission into a referendum on whether today is the day the margins finally close to zero. Curtis ought to be tried for criminal negligence. Major Harrison Thing says, though he knows the actual manufacturer is Glenn L. Martin Company. Knows that anger needs a target, even when the target is incorrect. Knows that somewhere in Baltimore, a company is stamping out these machines with peacetime assumptions about pilot training that have no relationship to the war that began 3 months ago with the smoking wreckage of Battleship Row. How do they expect us to train pilots in 12 weeks for an aircraft that requires the instincts and reflexes that come only from 500 hours in type? The door opens, and Captain Vincent Burns enters with a clipboard and the expression of a man who has stopped sleeping through the night. Another one at 0540, he reports. And the room goes quiet except for the distant thunder of more Marauders practicing circuits and bumps. Each one a calculated risk that the pilots are calculating very carefully indeed. Trainee stalled on final. Tried to stretch the glide. Clipped a hangar. Aircraft destroyed. Crew survived with injuries. That makes 7 major accidents since the first B-26S arrived at MacDill Field in January. 7 aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond repair in 72 days. Maitland sets down his coffee cup with the care of a man placing a time bomb on a delicate surface. "What's our current serviceable rate?" he asks, though he already knows the answer. Has memorized these numbers the way other men memorize baseball statistics or the lyrics to songs their wives sang on wedding days that seem to belong to different lifetimes on different planets where wars happen to other people. 41%, Burns responds, and the number hangs in the air like an accusation. We have 22 aircraft assigned. 9 are flyable today. 6 are awaiting spare parts. 7 are undergoing major repair from training accidents. If we were operational, if we were actually expected to fly combat missions tomorrow, we would be effectively combat ineffective before we encountered a single German fighter or fired a single round at a single target. Outside, another Marauder touches down. Tires screaming against concrete. Reverse thrust, howling. The entire airframe shuddering with what appears to be mechanical rage at the indignity of being forced to return to Earth when it was clearly designed to live in the thin, fast air at 12,000 feet where its speed advantage turns it into something predatory rather than something that pilots approach with the trepidation of men asked to mount wild horses with tempers and no interest in being ridden. Maitland thinks about the 68 crews currently in training at MacDill Field. Thinks about the production lines in Baltimore, turning out B-26S at a rate that will soon exceed 500 per month. Thinks about the war planners in Washington, who have already committed these aircraft to missions across North Africa and Europe and the Pacific, with the supreme confidence of men who work with organizational charts rather than actual machines that kill actual pilots when the equations of lift and drag and thrust fail to balance at the margins where combat operations inevitably push every system toward failure. "Get me Colonel Shepler at Training Command," he says finally, reaching for the telephone with the resignation of a man who knows the conversation ahead will change nothing, will alter no production schedules, will cause no reassessment of doctrine, because the United States military has made its decision and manufactured its commitments, and the B-26 Marauder is the medium bomber of the present and future. Regardless of whether pilots are dying in Florida trying to master an aircraft that seems to have been designed by engineers who understood aerodynamics brilliantly and pilot psychology not at all. The coffee in his cup has gone cold. The sky beyond the window has darkened with approaching weather. And somewhere in that sky, 68 crews are learning to fly an aircraft that half the Army Air Forces believes will kill more Americans than Germans. June 17th, 1943. 1340 hours. Luftwaffe Intelligence Section. Occupied France. Major Friedrich Volker places 3 reconnaissance photographs on the wooden table, with the precise spacing of a man arranging evidence for a court-martial. And in the gray light filtering through canvas blackout curtains, the images show what appears to be an impossibility 7 B-26 Marauders returning from a mission over the Abbeville marshalling yards with battle damage photographed by a pursuing Me-109 aircraft trailing smoke. One with visible holes in the vertical stabilizer. And all 7 still in tight formation, flying at what the camera analysis estimates to be 290 miles per hour. Faster than the Messerschmitt could sustain in level flight without pushing the engine past combat power limitations that mean certain failure if maintained for more than 15 minutes. Volker has flown 43 combat missions against American bombers, has watched flying fortresses absorb punishment that should rip them from the sky and still maintain formation, has developed a professional respect for the men who fly into flak fields with the regularity of postal carriers. But these photographs represent something he has not encountered before: an aircraft that refuses to slow down, even while dying. That maintains offensive formation integrity while trailing glycol and hydraulic fluid. That appears to have transformed the fundamental disadvantage of high wing loading into a tactical doctrine that makes interception a mathematics problem with no good solution. They're calling them the Hell's Angels. Hauptmann Klaus Reinhardt says, gesturing at the second photograph where 13 .50 caliber machine gun positions are marked with red circles by some meticulous intelligence analyst who has counted every barrel and calculated fields of fire with the thoroughness of an undertaker measuring dimensions. 12 to 13 guns per aircraft, mostly 50s, positioned to provide overlapping coverage in every axis nose: tail, dorsal, ventral, waist positions. The formation tactics are identical to the B-17 group's staggered boxes of 6 to 18 aircraft. Mutual defensive fire. But they're executing these formations at speeds that put our fighters at energy disadvantage before we even commit to attack runs. Volker picks up the third photograph. This one showing a close-up of a B-26's nose section, where an artist has painted a grinning demon astride a bomb with the legend "flak bait" in block letters that suggest either tremendous courage or an absolute disregard for the superstitions that most airmen cultivate like vegetable gardens in wartime. What are their loss rates? He asks, though he already suspects the answer will be troubling. Has already noticed that the daily intelligence summaries from Luftwaffe 3 have stopped mentioning B-26 kills with the frequency they did 6 months ago when the first groups arrived in England and began operations that seemed more like training exercises than combat missions. Tentative milk runs against coastal targets that suggested crews still learning their aircraft, still working through the technical challenges that had made the type notorious in American training programs. Reinhardt consults a folder thick with typed reports and handwritten annotations in the cramped script of men who work through nights by lamplight, because daylight belongs to bombers that arrive with mathematical regularity and industrial tonnages. In the past 90 days, the 322nd Bomb Group has flown 117 sorties against targets in occupied France and Belgium. They have lost 4 aircraft, 3 to flak, 1 to fighter attack for a loss rate of 3.4% per sortie. He pauses, letting that number settle into the room like sediment in still water. Compare that to the B-17 groups operating from England during the same period, loss rates ranging from 6 to 11% per sortie, depending on target depth and fighter opposition intensity. The 91st Bomb Group lost 12 aircraft in a single mission to Bremen last month, over 20% losses in one day. The mathematics are brutal and unambiguous. The aircraft that American pilots called the Widow Maker, that crashed with grim regularity during training operations throughout 1942, that arrived in Europe with a reputation for killing the men who flew it before enemy action could claim that privilege, has somehow transformed into the most survivable bomber in the American inventory. A statistical reversal so complete that it suggests not merely improved training or tactical refinement, but a fundamental misunderstanding of what the B-26 actually represented, what its dangerous handling characteristics had been preparing crews to survive. How is this possible? Volker asks. And the question is not rhetorical but genuine. The confusion of a professional warrior confronting data that contradicts all combat experience and tactical doctrine. An aircraft with approach speeds that make any battle damage potentially catastrophic. With wing loading that provides no margin for lost engine power. With a reputation in their own training command that borders on legendary. For how many men it killed before they ever saw combat, this aircraft should be falling from the sky in numbers that make their high command weep. Instead, they're losing them at rates that suggest invulnerability. Reinhardt stands and walks to the window, where outside a convoy of trucks is moving replacement parts toward forward airfields that seem to consume materiel the way locomotives consume coal, endlessly and with no visible decrease in appetite or operational tempo. I interviewed two pilots from WWII last week, Oberleutnant Mayer and Feldwebel König, both with over 30 confirmed kills, both experienced in attacks against American bomber formations. They describe the same tactical problem. The B-26 formations are fast enough that interception requires perfect positioning, which means we're burning fuel and ammunition on pursuit curves while they're maintaining steady courses at speeds that let them transit defended airspace before we can organize effective fighter concentrations. The few times we achieve good attack positioning, we're engaging formations with defensive firepower that equals or exceeds the B-17 boxes. And we're doing it in speed regimes where our aircraft handling is marginal, and their defensive gunners can track us through shorter engagement windows. He turns back to Volker with an expression that suggests he has thought about this problem during hours when sleep should have claimed him, but operational necessities demanded otherwise. But here's what concerns me most. Their sortie rates are increasing. 6 months ago, the 322nd was flying 1 or 2 missions per week, training missions. Essentially, building crew confidence. Now they're flying 4 to 6 times per week, hitting targets across our entire logistics network. And their aircraft availability rates appear to be phenomenal. The Americans are not losing B-26s on the ground to maintenance failures or technical issues. They're keeping them flying with reliability that suggests either their maintenance procedures have reached levels we haven't matched, or their supply systems are operating at scales that eliminate normal peacetime constraints. Volker studies the photographs again, looking for something he might have missed, some tactical weakness that would restore the natural order, where aircraft with dangerous handling characteristics pay for those dangers and combat losses that make them unsustainable. The images reveal nothing except tight formations and battle damage that would have destroyed lesser aircraft and professional crews executing their missions with the remorseless efficiency of factory workers on assembly lines that never stop moving forward regardless of individual fates or tactical setbacks. What are the Americans saying about it? He asks, thinking of the intelligence summaries that sometimes include captured documents or radio intercepts that reveal enemy morale and doctrine. Are their crews still afraid of this aircraft? Reinhardt smiles without humor. The expression of a man who's discovered that the joke is on him and the punchline is unpleasant. Quite the opposite. The 322nd has a waiting list of crews requesting transfer to B-26 units. They're calling it the sweetheart of the 8th Air Force. They've apparently decided that an aircraft that's difficult to fly is an aircraft that's difficult to shoot down. And they're treating the high wing loading and hot landing speeds as features rather than bugs characteristics that select for better pilots and reward precision flying with survival rates that speak for themselves. Outside, the sound of distant anti-aircraft fire echoes across the French countryside. Another American formation, somewhere over the horizon, executing another mission in a war that increasingly feels like watching an opponent who keeps producing reinforcements from reserves that should have exhausted themselves months ago, but somehow never do. Who keeps replacing losses faster than losses accumulate. Who approaches combat with the methodology of engineers, solving problems through iteration rather than warriors seeking glory through individual valor or tactical brilliance. Volker gathers the photographs and returns them to their folder with the care of a man handling documents that will someday explain how the impossible became routine and the routine became overwhelming. Increase surveillance of B-26 units, he orders, knowing the surveillance will reveal only more of the same more missions, more tight formations, more aircraft that refuse to behave like the death traps their reputation promised they would be. And prepare updated defensive tactics recommendations for forward fighter groups specifically addressing high-speed bomber interceptions. The words sound competent and professional and utterly inadequate to the reality captured in 3 reconnaissance photographs. The reality that the flying Coffin is burying German expectations rather than American crews. November 8th, 1943. 15:20 hours. Glenn L. Martin Company Plant, Baltimore, Maryland. The noise inside Building 7 is not merely loud, but a physical presence that vibrates through chest cavities and makes normal conversation impossible without shouting directly into someone's ear. And amid that industrial thunder, Eleanor Haas guides a rivet gun along the B-26's fuselage skin, with the precision that comes from repeating the same motion 11,000 times across 4 months of 60-hour weeks. Each rivet placed exactly 3 inches from the last. Each one driven with pressure that the technical manual specifies as 1,400 pounds per square inch for exactly 2.7 seconds. Not more, because that deforms the aluminum skin and creates stress points where cracks will propagate under combat loads. Not less, because that leaves gaps where moisture will enter and corrosion will begin the slow work of airframe degradation that means death at 10,000 feet over France when the vertical stabilizer separates from the fuselage during evasive maneuvers. She has never flown in an aircraft, has never traveled more than 40 miles from the Baltimore neighborhood where she was born, but she knows that somewhere over occupied Europe, men are trusting their lives to the rivets she placed this morning, yesterday, last week. And that knowledge makes her work with a concentration that supervisors notice and co-workers respect, and production managers photograph for recruiting posters that show women building bombers with captions about industrial patriotism and democracy's arsenal, and winning the war 1 rivet at a time. It was the mathematics of production. The Glenn L. Martin Company employed 8,200 workers in 1940 building commercial seaplanes and military trainers at rates measured in dozens per year. Peacetime schedules where quality control meant weeks of inspection and testing and refinement. By November 1943, The company employs 53,000 workers across 2 shifts, operating 7 days per week, building B-26 Marauders at a rate of 17 aircraft per day, 119 per week, 512 per month. A production tempo that has transformed the Baltimore waterfront into something approaching a continuous bomber assembly line, where raw aluminum enters at one end and complete aircraft capable of 280 miles per hour with 4,000 pounds of bombs emerge at the other end 48 hours later, each one carrying serial numbers that'll be recorded in mission logs and maintenance reports and combat loss statistics, and eventually in historical archives that document how America won wars, not through tactical brilliance, but through the overwhelming application of industrial capacity, organized with ruthless efficiency. The numbers accumulate like compound interest. 17 aircraft per day means 408 rivets per airframe, means 936 rivets per day, means 42,000 workers, each placing an average of 1 rivet every 6 minutes across 10-hour shifts. Means quality control inspectors walking assembly lines with gauges and calipers and rejection authority that can halt production when specifications drift outside tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The Martin Company consumes 17,000 pounds of aluminum per aircraft, means 289,000 pounds per day, means 14 railroad cars of raw materials arriving daily from Alcoa plants in Pennsylvania and Tennessee, where electricity generated by TVA dams converts bauxite ore into aircraft-grade alloy through electrolytic processes that consume enough power to light a city of 50,000 people. All of it transformed into bombers that will fly missions for approximately 8 months before combat attrition or mechanical obsolescence retires them to training units or scrap yards, where the aluminum will be recycled back into the production stream. An industrial metabolism that digests resources at one end and excretes military capability at the other, with the efficiency of biological systems optimized across millions of years of evolutionary pressure. Captain Richard Mallory walks through Building 7 with a manufacturing liaison officer from Wright Field and feels himself simultaneously awed and unsettled by the sheer scale of the operation. The way it transforms abstract concepts like medium bomber production into concrete reality measured in square footage and worker density and the distinctive smell of hot metal and cutting oil and human sweat that characterizes heavy industry operating at maximum sustainable output. We had concerns in early 1,942 inches, he shouts over the machinery noise, gesturing toward a partially assembled B-26 suspended from overhead cranes while workers swarm across its surfaces like anatomists, dissecting something that has not yet died. That the B-26's reputation would make recruiting pilots impossible. Training Command was losing aircraft at rates that made commanders question whether the program should continue. There were congressional inquiries. Senator Truman's committee investigated whether the Martin Company had sold the Army Air Forces an aircraft that was fundamentally unsafe. The liaison officer, a major named Peterson, who spent 18 months as an engineering test pilot before desk duties claimed him, nods and makes notes on a clipboard that already contains 3 pages of observations about quality control procedures and supply chain logistics. What changed? He asks, though he has read the reports and knows the general outline, if not the specific details. Knows that somewhere between the disasters of 1942 and the operational successes of 1943, the B-26 went from liability to asset, from widowmaker to sweetheart, from training fatality statistics to combat survival rates that make it the safest bomber in the American inventory. Mallory guides them past a station where women are installing the 50 caliber machine gun mounting systems that will transform each B-26 into a flying fortress of interlocking fields of fire. 12 guns per aircraft. 50 aircraft leaving the plant per week. 600 guns per week. 31,000 rounds of ammunition per aircraft loaded before combat missions. Enough defensive firepower that German fighter pilots have learned to respect the formations and pick off stragglers rather than attempting head-on attacks against boxes where overlapping fire can destroy a pursuing fighter in the 3-second window between initial engagement and breaking off. We lengthen the wings, he explains, pointing to a technical diagram mounted on the wall showing the evolution from the original B-26 design to the B-26B with its increased wingspan and added wing surface area. Increased span from 65 feet to 71 feet. Increased wing area from 602 square feet to 658 square feet. Decreased wing loading from 48 pounds per square foot to 41 pounds per square foot. We also extended the nose gear strut by 6 inches to increase angle of attack on takeoff, which improved lift characteristics during the critical transition from ground run to flight. The modifications sound simple when described in engineering terminology. Minor adjustments to dimension and proportion that any competent aircraft designer could specify on a drawing board. But Peterson knows that implementing these changes across an active production line, producing 17 aircraft per day, required reorganizing supply chains and retraining workers, and recertifying manufacturing processes, and updating technical manuals, and modifying every piece of tooling and equipment that touches wing assembly. A cascade of industrial complexity that most military procurement officers would consider impossible without shutting down production entirely for months while the changes propagated through the system. We never stopped the line, Mallory says, reading Peterson's expression with the practiced skill of a man who has explained this miracle multiple times to visitors who arrive skeptical and leave convinced that they have witnessed something approaching industrial sorcery. We implemented the wing modifications progressively across November and December 1942 while maintaining full production output. We had B-26S with original wings and B-26Bs with extended wings coming off the same assembly line simultaneously. Some workers were building old specification aircraft in the morning and new specification aircraft in the afternoon. It was chaos organized at a level that should have been impossible. And it worked because everyone from the shop floor to the executive offices understood that stopping production was not an option. That bomber groups in North Africa and England were flying combat missions with the aircraft we'd already built, and needed reinforcements at rates that matched combat losses, plus expansion of operational units, plus training pipeline requirements, plus maintenance reserves. They reach the final assembly station where a completed B-26B sits gleaming under industrial lighting. Its twin Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines installed and cowled. Its distinctive high-mounted tail suggesting aggressive aerodynamics. Its olive-drab paint scheme interrupted by the white star insignias that mark it as American property built with American materials by American workers, who will never see the targets it will attack or the crews whose lives depend on the quality of work, measured in rivets and welds and electrical connections executed to specifications that allow no tolerance for error or approximation. How many? Peterson asks, gesturing toward the aircraft and meaning not this one specifically, but all of them. The endless stream of bombers flowing from Baltimore to modification centers to training bases to combat squadrons to missions over France and Germany and Italy and the Pacific Theater, where different bomber groups are discovering the same surprising truth about the B-26's combat survivability. Mallory consults a production schedule that he carries folded in his jacket pocket. The numbers updated daily by staff who track every aircraft from first rivet to final delivery. We've built 1,883 B-26s as of this morning. Current production rate means we'll reach 2,000 aircraft by end of November. Projected total program 157 aircraft through March 1945, when production is scheduled to end as we transition to B-29 Super Fortress orders. He pauses, letting those numbers settle. Letting Peterson calculate what 157 medium bombers means in terms of aluminum and engines and ammunition and fuel and trained crews and maintenance personnel, and all the logistics that transform industrial output into combat capability. The Martin Company is currently producing more pounds of combat aircraft per month than the entire German aviation industry produced in all of 1938. We're doing it with workers who had never seen an aircraft factory until 1941. And we're doing it with quality control standards that result in aircraft that come home from combat missions at rates that make the B-26 statistically safer than transport aircraft. Outside Building 7, another B-26B is being towed toward the flight line, where test pilots will verify that every system functions according to specification before the aircraft is accepted by the Army Air Forces and added to the inventory of bombers that will fly east across the Atlantic to join groups that need replacements for combat losses, and expansion aircraft for new squadrons, and training aircraft for crews learning that the Flying Coffin nickname belongs to history rather than current reality. Eleanor Haas drives another rivet and reaches for the next one in a rhythm that has become automatic. Muscle memory replacing conscious thought. And somewhere in that rivet is the answer to why the B-26 survived its terrible reputation. Because eventually the mathematics of production overcome the mathematics of mortality. And enough aircraft built well enough by enough workers means that even dangerous aircraft become safe through the simple expedient of building so many that crews learn to fly them properly before the attrition rate can empty the training pipeline. The rivet gun fires with a pneumatic hiss that sounds like industrial breathing. The bomber grows toward completion one fastener at a time, and the war continues toward conclusions that will be written in production statistics rather than battlefield heroics. May 17, 1944, 0815 hours. Somewhere over occupied Belgium, 11,000 feet. The B-26 Marauder, designated Dynamite, shudders as flak bursts bracket the formation. Black flowers blooming in blue sky with the mathematical precision of German gunners, who have calculated altitude and airspeed and lead angles through thousands of hours of practice shooting at bombers that arrive with the regularity of mail trains. And First Lieutenant Robert Travis maintains heading and airspeed, while the bombardier in the nose calls corrections over the intercom with the calm voice of a man reading grocery lists, rather than guiding 4,000 pounds of high explosive toward a rail junction that German logistics officers need to keep ammunition flowing toward Normandy, where Allied armies are preparing an invasion that everyone knows is coming, but nobody can predict precisely when or where. The flak is close enough that Travis can smell the cordite through gaps in the fuselage skin, can feel the aircraft buck and twist as pressure waves from near misses translate into aerodynamic disturbances, can see two B-26s ahead, trailing smoke from engine fires that will either be controlled in the next 90 seconds or will consume the aircraft in the air, turning men and aluminum into falling debris that will crater Belgian farmland and become statistics in mission reports typed by clerks who never hear the sound of metal tearing or smell the distinctive odor of burning hydraulic fluid mixed with human fear. Bomb bay doors open. The bombardier announces, his voice cracking slightly on the word doors because he is 19 years old and has been at war for 6 weeks and has learned that combat is 90% boredom, punctuated by minutes when death arrives with the randomness of dice thrown by an indifferent god who plays no favorites between Americans and Germans and Belgian civilians who happen to be standing near rail junctions, when the mathematics of strategic bombing require their neighborhoods to be destroyed for reasons that will make sense in future history books, but offer no comfort in the present moment. 30 seconds to release. Travis holds the yoke with pressure that turns his knuckles white against leather gloves. Fighting the turbulence from flak bursts and the instinct to jink left or right or drop altitude or climb or do anything except maintain this perfectly straight and level flight path that exposes his aircraft and crew to every anti-aircraft gun within 3 miles. This requirement of precision bombing that makes every bombardier's life dependent on every pilot's nerve. That turns the final approach to target into a test of whether you can continue flying toward the thing that is trying to kill you with the same steady determination that you might show flying toward a landing field on a training mission over Florida, where the only danger was your own error rather than enemy action, coordinated by men who are very good at their jobs and very motivated to shoot down American bombers before those bombers destroy the infrastructure that keeps German armies supplied and mobile. The formation is tight. 18 B-26s in 3 boxes of 6 aircraft each, staggered vertically and horizontally to provide overlapping fields of fire from 72.50 caliber machine guns that track constantly across the sky looking for the Focke-Wulf 190S and Messerschmitt 109S that should be hitting them by now. That should be diving through the formation with cannons firing and accepting whatever losses the defensive fire inflicts, because that is the doctrine. That is how air defense works when bombers arrive over your territory with intentions to destroy things you need to keep functioning. But the fighters have not come, have been noticeably absent for the past 2 weeks. And the intelligence officers at briefing this morning suggested that Luftwaffe fighter strength is being conserved for the invasion or has been redeployed east to deal with Soviet advances or has simply been eroded by attrition faster than German training programs can replace losses. Though nobody is certain and nobody is celebrating because the flak is still here and the flak does not need fuel or replacement parts or rest periods between missions. Bombs away. The bombardier calls, and Travis feels the aircraft leap upward as 4,000 pounds depart the bomb bay. Feels the sudden freedom of an aircraft that has completed its primary mission and can now focus entirely on the secondary mission of getting everyone home alive to fly another mission tomorrow or the day after that. The endless succession of missions that define combat operations. In 1944, when bomber groups fly not once per week, as they did in 1943, but 4 or 5 or 6 times per week. When a tempo of operations has accelerated to match production output. When every group maintains mission-ready rates above 70% because spare parts arrive from depot maintenance facilities within hours rather than days. And replacement aircraft arrive from the United States, faster than combat losses can deplete inventories. The formation executes a coordinated turn, 18 aircraft banking in perfect synchronization, like a flight of birds that have practiced this maneuver so many times that individual action has merged into collective instinct. And Travis pushes the throttles forward to cruise power that will take them back across Belgium and across the Channel to bases in England, where ground crews are already preparing hot coffee and debriefing forms and maintenance inspections that will determine which aircraft are mission-ready for tomorrow's operations. The airspeed indicator climbs past 270 miles per hour. The B-26 settling into the high-speed cruise regime where it becomes not merely fast, but sustainably fast, where the engines can maintain power settings hour after hour without the overheating or oil consumption that plague other aircraft pushed to maximum performance, where the fundamental design decision to prioritize speed over ease of handling pays dividends measured in survival rates and mission completion statistics. Flak damage report. Travis calls over the intercom, beginning the mental accounting that every aircraft commander performs after combat. The inventory of holes and systems failures and crew injuries that will determine whether they land at home base or divert to emergency fields or a ditch in the Channel where air-sea rescue units maintain constant patrols with boats and aircraft scanning for crews who made it into life rafts, but will die of exposure within hours if not recovered quickly. The responses come back across the intercom with the practiced efficiency of men who have trained together and flown together and learned to compress complex information into short declarative sentences. Tail gunner reports minor skin damage to rudder, but controls respond normally. Waist gunner reports hydraulic leak in the port landing gear system, but pressure holding steady. Radio operator reports electrical system functioning normally. Bombardier reports nose glass cracked but intact. All crew members accounted for and uninjured. No fires. Both engines operating at full power. Fuel consumption within normal parameters for combat mission profile. They are going home. They are going home at speeds that turn the Channel crossing from an extended period of vulnerability into a 40-minute transit, where German fighters would need perfect positioning and sustained pursuit just to reach firing range before the English coast provides the protection of friendly fighter cover and anti-aircraft batteries that have learned to distinguish between Allied and enemy aircraft with accuracy that suggests either excellent training or the consequences of mistakes being measured in courts-martial rather than routine after-action reports. Travis watches the coastline materialize through scattered clouds, the distinctive white cliffs that have guided damaged bombers home since 1942 that represent the boundary between war and temporary safety. Between occupied Europe, where everything that moves is potentially hostile, and England, where at least the ground fire will not target you deliberately, though accidents happen, and aircraft recognition is an imperfect science practiced by men with seconds to make decisions that mean life or death. The base appears on schedule, exactly where the navigator promised it would be, because navigation has become a science refined through thousands of missions and millions of miles flown. Because crews have learned that precision in the air translates to survival rates that make the difference between coming home and becoming statistics and casualty reports that arrive at families who will spend the rest of their lives wondering about final moments and whether death was instant or prolonged, whether their sons or husbands or brothers knew what was happening, or were granted the mercy of sudden darkness without time for fear or regret, or the thousand thoughts that fill the mind when it realizes that continuation is no longer an option being negotiated, but a fact already determined by physics and circumstance. Landing the B-26 requires Travis to perform the same precise speed control that made Training Command notorious. The same narrow margin between safe approach and stall that has killed experienced pilots and inexperienced pilots alike when attention wandered or when battle damage changed aircraft handling characteristics in ways that could not be anticipated until the moment when the wings stopped generating lift and gravity reasserted dominance with finality that leaves no opportunity for recovery or second chances. He calls for landing gear down and watches the indicator lights confirm that 3 wheels have extended and locked, calls for flaps, and feels the aircraft slow and settle as drag increases and lift redistributes across the wing's surface. Calls for final approach speed and watches the airspeed indicator stabilize at 140 miles per hour. Still fast enough that the runway appears to rush toward them rather than approach with the sedate inevitability of slower aircraft. Still fast enough that any error in flare timing or touchdown point will result in either overshooting the runway or touching down too hard and collapsing the landing gear or any of the dozen other failure modes that make B-26 landings events that ground crews watch with interest and occasional apprehension. The wheels touch with a chirp of rubber against concrete, and Travis applies brake pressure with the careful modulation that comes from repetition, holding the nose wheel off until aerodynamic speed bleeds down to the point where gravity and friction take over from lift and thrust. Feeling the aircraft transition from flying machine to rolling machine to stopped machine in the space of 3,000 feet. Parking at the hard stand where Crew Chief Technical Sergeant Michael Romano is already approaching with maintenance clipboard and the expression of a man whose professional life consists of keeping these aircraft flying despite combat damage and mechanical wear and the countless small failures that accumulate across hundreds of hours of operation at power settings that peacetime manufacturers would consider abusive. Travis shuts down the engines, and the sudden silence feels unnatural after 4 hours of continuous noise. The ringing in his ears, a reminder that sound damage is cumulative and permanent, and will eventually leave him partially deaf in the same way that radiation from instrument panels will eventually give him cancer, and lead exposure from aviation fuel will eventually poison him in ways that will not be fully understood until decades later, when the cost of this war will be calculated not merely in immediate casualties, but in the extended mortality of men who survived combat, only to die slowly from the industrial byproducts of the machinery that saved them. He climbs out of the cockpit and down through the bomb bay to the ground where the grass is wet with morning dew, and the air smells of English countryside rather than cordite and burning oil. Romano is already examining the flak damage, counting holes, assessing repairs, making calculations about how long this aircraft will be out of service before it can fly another mission. Could be worse, he says, which is the closest Romano comes to optimism. His worldview shaped by 2 years of repairing bombers that return from missions looking like metal sieves, and sometimes do not return at all, leaving empty hard stands and personal effects to be packed and shipped to families with letters that begin with "regret to inform you." Rudder skin needs patching. Hydraulic line needs replacement. Couple of flak holes in the fuselage that will patch with sheet aluminum. Have her ready by tomorrow afternoon if the parts arrive on schedule. Tomorrow afternoon means tomorrow's mission, or the day after. Means the relentless operational tempo continues without pause. Means that the B-26s keep flying, because they have proven themselves through the only metric that matters. In combat aviation, they bring crews home at rates that exceed any other bomber in the American inventory. Faster than B-17s, faster than B-24s, faster than the medium bombers that other nations fly with higher loss rates and lower operational tempos. Travis walks toward the debriefing room where intelligence officers will ask detailed questions about flak concentrations and fighter activity and bomb impact points and 100 other details that will be compiled into reports that flow upward through command structures until they reach planners who will use this information to select tomorrow's targets and tomorrow's routes and tomorrow's formations that will fly into tomorrow's flak and return tomorrow evening to repeat this process until either the war ends or the crews run out of luck or industrial capacity tips so far in one direction that the other side simply cannot continue. The coffee is hot and bitter and exactly what he needs. The debriefing forms are waiting. And dynamite is already being repaired for the next mission, the next test of whether mathematics continues to favor survival over statistics. April 29th, 1945, 11:25 hours, POW compound, Moosburg, Bavaria. Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann stands near the wire fence watching American trucks arrive in columns that stretch beyond the horizon. And what strikes him most forcefully is not the liberation itself. The war has been lost for months. Visible in every retreating Wehrmacht unit and every smoldering city and every supply depot emptied of everything except excuses, but rather the sheer abundance of materiel that accompanies even this minor operation. The way each truck carries not merely soldiers, but spare tires strapped to sides and jerry cans of fuel lashed to bumpers and crates of rations stacked in cargo beds, as if the American supply chain anticipates not scarcity, but excess. Plans not for making do, but for having surplus. Operates according to logistics philosophy that assumes waste is preferable to shortage, and that the mathematics of overproduction solve problems that careful rationing and efficient distribution cannot. He has been a prisoner since February, when his Me-109 took British anti-aircraft fire over the Rhine and forced him to belly land in a field where American infantry found him unconscious and bleeding and transported him here to this camp, where 15,000 men from a dozen nations wait for wars to end and futures to resume. And during these months, he has listened to guards discuss supply requisitions with the casual indifference of men who have never worried that the food would not arrive, or the fuel would not reach forward units, or the ammunition would run out during combat operations. One of the trucks stops near the fence, and a soldier jumps down carrying a carton of cigarettes that he begins distributing to prisoners with the cheerful generosity of someone disposing of inventory that will only be replaced tomorrow by more inventory generated by factories that apparently operate at production levels divorced from any concept of limitation or constraint. Lucky strikes. The soldier announces in German that sounds practiced, probably learned from phrase books or previous prisoner interactions. Compliments of the United States Army. Welcome to freedom, boys. Hoffmann accepts a pack and examines it with the attention of a man who has not held anything manufactured to civilian quality standards in 4 years. The cardboard firm and undamaged. The cellophane wrapper intact. The cigarettes themselves uniform in size and packing density. No variation that would suggest wartime substitutions or quality compromises or manufacturing under duress. He lights one and tastes tobacco that is fresh rather than stale, properly cured rather than cut with substitute materials. And the small luxury feels disproportionately significant. A tangible reminder that the nation now occupying Germany approaches war with industrial surplus, while Germany itself has been grinding down toward exhaustion for months. Consuming stockpiles faster than production could replace them. Fighting with equipment that should have been replaced years ago, but remains in service, because nothing better exists to replace it with. "How many bomber missions did you fly?" asks Hauptmann Klaus Reinhardt, walking over from the barracks with the slow gait of a man whose hip was shattered by fighter fire and set improperly and now causes him to limp, with a permanent reminder that combat injuries in the Luftwaffe receive treatment determined by availability of medical supplies rather than medical necessity. He is the same intelligence officer who studied B-26 reconnaissance photographs in France 18 months ago, who tried to understand how an aircraft with a terrible reputation had become the safest bomber in the American inventory, who now finds himself on the receiving end of that industrial capacity he once attempted to quantify through mission reports and loss statistics. 43, Hoffman replies, exhaling smoke that rises towards skies that now belong exclusively to Allied aircraft, that have been surrendered not through tactical defeat, but through the simple mathematical reality that Germany cannot build fighters fast enough to replace combat losses, while the Americans and British produce aircraft at rates that turn attrition into a renewable resource rather than a strategic limitation. Against American bomber formations, mostly B-17S and B-24S, some B-26 missions toward the end. Reinhardt nods slowly, his eyes tracking the American trucks with the studied attention of a professional intelligence officer who continues analyzing even in captivity, because analysis is what intelligence officers do when all other options have been exhausted. I spent months trying to understand their bomber loss rates, specifically the B-26 numbers. We kept expecting them to suffer attrition that would force them to reduce operational tempo or withdraw units for retraining or show some indication that the aircraft was living up to its reputation as the Widowmaker. Instead, the opposite happened. Their loss rates dropped below 1% per sortie. They were flying 4 or 5 missions per week per group. They were hitting targets across our entire logistics network with the regularity of train schedules. He gestures toward the trucks, toward the casual abundance of supplies being distributed with no apparent inventory control or careful rationing, toward the overwhelming evidence that the war was lost, not because German tactics failed or German courage wavered, but because German industrial capacity could not compete with economies that produced endless streams of materiel and shipped it across oceans and distributed it through supply chains that functioned with the efficiency of peacetime commerce. I finally understood it about 6 months ago when I saw the production numbers, not German estimates, but actual American statistics from documents we captured. The Glenn L. Martin Company alone produced over 5,000 B-26 bombers during the war. 5,000 medium bombers from one manufacturer. We were losing aircraft faster than we could build them, while the Americans were building them faster than we could shoot them down. The mathematics became inescapable. They could afford to lose bombers at rates we considered acceptable because their production lines replaced losses within days rather than months. Another truck arrives, this one carrying medical supplies that American doctors begin unloading with the systematic efficiency of men executing procedures they have performed hundreds of times, sorting boxes by category and priority with speed that suggests either excellent training or systems designed to be intuitive, even under stress. Hoffman watches a young corpsman distribute sulfa drugs and wound dressings and morphine ampoules with quantities that would equip a German field hospital for a month. And the casual abundance makes him wonder whether the American military has ever experienced actual shortage, whether their logistics officers have ever faced the choice between treating wounded soldiers and saving medical supplies for tomorrow's casualties that might be worse, whether they have any framework for understanding war as something other than industrial problem-solving at scales that turns scarcity into theoretical concept rather than operational reality. They called them flying coffins in their own training command. Reinhardt continues, his voice carrying the tone of a man working through a puzzle that has finally revealed its solution after months of incomplete information and false assumptions. Their pilots died in training accidents throughout 1942, at rates that made their congressional committees investigate whether the program should be canceled. The aircraft had wing loading that made it dangerous to fly, approach speeds that left no margin for error, handling characteristics that killed experienced pilots. By every reasonable metric, it should have failed, should have been withdrawn from service, or relegated to secondary roles, or suffered combat losses that made it unsustainable. He pauses to light one of the American cigarettes, studying the smoke as if it contains revelations written in vapor and dissipating revelation. But they solved it through production volume and training standardization. They built so many B-26s that eventually they had enough aircraft for training units to practice until crews mastered the difficult handling characteristics. They standardized maintenance procedures across all units so that technical problems were identified and resolved systematically rather than repeatedly. They implemented modifications to wing design that improved handling without stopping production lines. They did everything that conventional military wisdom says is impossible during wartime. They iterated and improved while maintaining operational tempo and increasing sortie rates and reducing loss rates simultaneously. An American officer approaches, a captain whose uniform is clean enough to suggest recent arrival from rear areas where laundry facilities function normally, and whose face carries the expression of someone performing humanitarian duties rather than military operations. Someone who has been told that the prisoners are defeated enemies, but should be treated with dignity consistent with Geneva Conventions and basic human decency. "Gentlemen," he says in German that is better than the enlisted soldiers, accent suggesting university education rather than phrasebook memorization. Medical personnel will be conducting health screenings this afternoon. Food distribution will begin at 1400 hours. You will be processed for repatriation over the next several weeks, depending on nationality and documentation status. The casual competence with which he delivers this information, the assumption that systems exist to handle 15,000 prisoners with medical care and food distribution and documentation processing, strikes Hoffman as perhaps the most devastating evidence of defeat. The Americans are liberating this camp almost as an afterthought. A minor logistics operation that requires no special preparation or resource allocation. Something they can accomplish while simultaneously fighting in the Pacific and occupying Japan and maintaining forces across Europe and apparently never worrying that the supplies might not arrive or the systems might break down or the industrial capacity might prove insufficient to the requirements being placed upon it. Reinhardt drops his cigarette and grinds it under his boot with the finality of a man completing a chapter he wishes he could have written differently. I calculated their B-26 production numbers against our total medium bomber production, all types, all manufacturers, entire war. They built more B-26s than we built He-111s, Ju-88s, and Do-217s combined. One aircraft type from one manufacturer exceeded our entire medium bomber production. And those B-26s flew more sorties and dropped more bombs and suffered lower loss rates and brought more crews home than any bomber in their inventory. He looks at Hoffman with eyes that have seen the future and found it unpleasant for men on the losing side. The Flying Coffin became the safest bomber of the war, not because they fixed its handling characteristics, though they improved them, and not because they developed better tactics, though tactics helped, but because they built enough of them that their pilots learned to fly them properly, maintained them effectively, and deployed them at operational tempos we could not match or counter or survive. They industrialized survival. They turned bomber crew mortality from individual tragedy into statistical management problem and solved it through production volume and training standardization. The American trucks continue arriving. An endless convoy of supplies and personnel and equipment flowing into Bavaria with the confidence of organizations that have never worried about next week's fuel allocation or next month's spare parts delivery, or next year's industrial capacity. That approach were the way Detroit approaches automobile manufacturing or Pittsburgh approaches steel production. As problems of scale and efficiency and systematic optimization, rather than heroism and sacrifice and making do with insufficient resources against overwhelming odds. Hoffman thinks about the 43 missions he flew, about the American bomber formations he attacked, about the B-26S that seemed impossibly fast and heavily defended and able to absorb battle damage that should have been catastrophic. He thinks about the pilots who flew those aircraft, who mastered the difficult handling characteristics and turned disadvantages into tactical advantages and survived missions at rates that made the B-26 statistically safer than transport aircraft. He thinks about the factories in Baltimore, where workers built 17 aircraft per day, every day, until they had built 5,000 bombers that would help win a war through the overwhelming application of industrial capacity, organized with ruthless efficiency. It was never about the aircraft, he says quietly, watching the sun glint off another American truck, arriving with more supplies for prisoners who are no longer Germany's responsibility, but America's logistical problem to solve with the same systematic competence they applied to everything else. It was about the system that produced the aircraft, the training that prepared crews, the logistics that kept them flying, the industrial capacity that replaced losses faster than losses accumulated. We were fighting crews. They were fighting with systems. Systems always win eventually. Reinhardt nods slowly, and in that gesture is the acknowledgement of every intelligence officer who spent the war trying to quantify an enemy that operated according to rules that made German military traditions seem quaint and outdated. Who approached combat with industrial methodology rather than warrior ethos, who won through mathematics rather than courage, though courage was also present, who proved that modern war belongs to nations with factories rather than nations with only fighting spirit. The fence that has held them for months will come down tomorrow. The war that killed millions has ended with surrender documents signed in rooms far from battlefields. And the B-26 Marauder that pilots once called the Flying Coffin sits in history books with the statistical distinction of being the safest American bomber of World War II. 0.5% losses per sortie during final operations. 129,943 combat missions flown. 157 aircraft built. A production and operational achievement that represents not tactical brilliance, but industrial inevitability. Not individual heroism, but systematic capability. Not the triumph of one aircraft design, but the victory of an entire economic system, organized for war and executed with the efficiency that turns impossibility into routine and routine into overwhelming advantage. The cigarette smoke dissipates into Bavarian air. The trucks continue arriving with supplies that seem inexhaustible. And somewhere in Baltimore, the factory floor that once echoed with rivet guns has gone silent now that peace has made bombers unnecessary again. The mathematics of survival, replaced by the mathematics of conversion back to peacetime production. The great industrial symphony concluded. The instruments put away. The players dispersing to lives where nobody will ask them to build 17 bombers per day, but they will carry forever the knowledge that once they did exactly that and changed the world through the accumulated work of rivets placed precisely, systems assembled correctly, aircraft delivered on schedule to pilots who flew them home against odds that should have killed them but didn't, because somewhere in the mathematics of production and training and logistics was the answer to how you turn a flying Coffin into the safest bomber of the war. It was not impossible after all. It was just industrial arithmetic applied with patience and precision until the numbers shifted and the outcome changed, and the aircraft that killed pilots in training saved them in combat through the simple expedient of being built in such quantities and maintained with such care and flown with such skill that survival became not miraculous but statistical, not exceptional but expected, not the triumph of individuals but the victory of systems that had learned to manufacture survival as efficiently as they manufactured bombers.